Distance, hello. That's the standard I'm aiming for with this talk. Let's see if we can get there together. So my talk is called Bertolt's Intent, which is a brilliant name for a pretentious ex-theatre studies student to call, because what's brilliant about it is A, it sounds really clever. B, it pretentiously assumes that I know what a guy in Germany in the middle of the last century was thinking. And 3, my presumption at calling him by his first name. So it's hitting all of those bases. This is fun. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk, because I think this is the first time I've talked about anything other than myself on stage for an incredibly long amount of time, and it's honestly really cool. Thank you. Cool. We'll be fishing for a lot of those as the talk goes on. Thank you very much. I'm going to describe what would be on the screen at all points. So the first slide was brilliant. So I had, I think it was Batman, Star Wars, and Aliens, and something else, James Bond. And it's kind of a trite point that we make a lot, that video games and kind of the prevailing mega franchise, mega visible products, and they are products that are out there in the world, they often draw on those themes. You know, if you play any contemporary big budget game, you can usually make assumptions based on that game that whoever made it was really into these 4 things, right? And that's a historical problem, and honestly, I think it's already shifting as more interesting people get into making video games. But it's there. And honestly, I'm not sure it's terrible either. I think the idea of taking stuff that you love and being influenced by it and reinterpreting it and kind of remixing all of that stuff is kind of cool. And I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing. And that's what I want to talk about right now, is about stealing and about taking stuff that already exists. And I want to use a slightly pretentious example in order to make that point. I could probably have done this with Tarantino just as easily, but I would have looked less clever. And that's very important to me, more than any of you can know. So the next image that came up is, I think, the 5th image. It's come up on Google image results when you type in theatre. I went for the 5th. The 2nd was better, but I felt that, I don't know why I felt that someone would look at this and think, he obviously picked the 1st image that came up. So for some reason I decided to go for the 5th. It's very good though. It's like, I think it was of the Globe Theatre. And theatre is something I'm very into. True story, video games are my backup plan for the acting career that I really wanted to have as a kid. I was a bit of a show-off. This will come as a shock. And I honestly wasn't good looking enough. I once ran out of an audition crying because a director decided that I was not good looking enough to play a young Antonio Banderas. And they were right. But that's a very hard message to hear when you're 13. Was it Antonio Banderas or Nicolas Cage? No, it was Antonio Banderas. Nicolas Cage I could probably have pulled off, to be honest with you. So theatre is very important to me. It's something that I love. It's something that I'm constantly stealing stuff from, and I get away with it, and people think it's new because they've not seen this stuff. And I would recommend that. Like, if you want to look really original, find something no one else has heard of and just copy it. So that's a quote I'm going to have thrown back at me at some point. And yeah, so theatre's great. I think theatre's a very good lens, and I know there's been some talks of these before about theatre. But there's lots of stuff to use there. Improvisation, the idea of the actor, the idea of a participant in a piece of narrative. We look at a lot of media that has audiences. Theatre has audiences, but more importantly, has actors, and there's lots of stuff, especially if you look at contemporary stuff. There's a lot of really interesting lessons there for how to tell stories with actors who are part of that. I would then jump to the next slide, which, similar to the theatre image, is the 2nd most popular image of Bertolt Brecht. It's not the one that everyone who's heard of Bertolt Brecht and gone to the Wikipedia page has seen. It's the next one up. It's actually the 3rd, because the 2nd is really good, but wasn't high resolution enough. I thought it'd look awful on the screen, so I went for the 3rd. It's very good. He looks cool in it. It's very well framed. I kind of changed the composition a little bit. So for those of you who don't know, any pretentious theatre studies students, Bertolt Brecht was a I guess, active mainly in kind of the mid-century of the last century. He was a German. He was communist to some extent. That's argued. He was a communist until McCarthy asked him. And as you can imagine, being a theatre director in mid-century Germany, he didn't stay in Germany, and a lot of his later work was later as well. Honestly, his life is fascinating and completely outside the scope of a 15-minute talk, so I'm just going to skip over it. But the thing that really interests me is he was a man with intent, and that's a very core thing of what I want to talk about, which is why it's in the title. Intent's really important. Why you do things, why you steal things. Stealing things because they're cool. It's an intent, but it's much more. I'm sorry, I'm really close. I'm getting the breathing. Let's go there somewhere. Intent's really important because if you steal the product of something, then you're only stealing a very surface level interpretation. But if you can work out the reasons why a choice was made and duplicate that, then that's really cool, because then you can actively get stuff from it. And also you can come up with a new idea, which is even cooler. He was fascinating. He's someone who came up, he kind of started his practice kind of late 20s, 30s, in a very interesting time in theatre, because at that point film was growing in importance and relevance, and the idea of realism was coming in a big way. I'm tiptoeing around your talk, by the way, but I've been told it was just in Nottingham, so I'm getting away with it. He built on this idea. He was surrounded by realism, Stanislavski, method acting. The film camera was making faces, 20 feet high, and that meant a whole different way of telling stories, a whole different way of acting was emerging, and he hated that, actually. Oh dear. These were real. Sorry, 1 second, because I usually have the slides which help me understand where I am. So this is the point. Oh dear. No, we're carrying on. Actors were taking off their masks. This was actually, I think this was a still of a silent movie. It's Metropolis, because I knew you'd all know what Metropolis was, and it's honestly the only film from that era that I knew how to Google. But that was the presiding wisdom. The presiding wisdom that was storytelling was about conveying reality. You were looking in. Ibsen had popularized kind of this idea of the room with the missing fourth wall. The idea of you're looking in, actors are not aware they're part of the performance, and you're forgetting that you're an audience member. You're getting swept away with it. So here I jump to, I think it's an image of Charlie Chaplin, which is not relevant to this section. But I couldn't find, because I want to talk about Chinese theatre a bit, but Chinese theatre, you type Chinese theatre, you get exactly what you think you get. You don't get what you actually want. So I had Chaplin up here, who was one of Brecht's contemporaries, and they kind of chatted, and pretentious people like to pretend that Chaplin stole stuff from Brecht. He probably didn't, but people like to think he did. But Brecht liked. He liked retro stuff. He liked the old days. He liked Greek theatre. He liked Chinese theatre. He liked stuff that was about making big, epic stuff. He didn't care about all these emotional theatre people. He wasn't interested in the objectives. He was thinking very, very retroactively. And he liked it theatrical. This is the point where I jump to, if this was a good slide, this is the posters for every Hallmark Channel Christmas special movie, which I hold very dear because my mother-in-law demands on watching these. There's a channel on Sky which is just all of these awful 90s with awful. The Hoff is in 50% of them, and these awful kind of Hallmark things. And that was what Brecht was terrified. That was the future he foresaw, was that cathartic theatre about people and emotions, was going to become a science. It was going to become a heartstring pulling exercise. That moment, the classic kind of you have to save the cat thing where, 3/4 of the way through, the hero's on the ropes, and is he going to make it? Yeah, of course he is. But that kind of cathartic excitement you have in that final act of every movie, Brecht thought that was awful. He hated the idea that was going to become just a shorthand, and we all see it, and every movie's built around it nowadays. This catharsis, Brecht worried about on a creative level because he thought it was rubbish. But he also worried about it on a political level because he worried about people being distracted by theatre. This is a man working in the 30s in Germany. He was seeing some horrible shit. And he was very worried about that, and he had like Nazis throwing stuff at his stage and stuff. So he was terrified that he drew a line between what was happening in politics and what was happening in the theatres and the distraction that was happening around him. He was scared, and he wanted to create this epic theatre. Now, if he hadn't been a genius, if he just felt this way, if he'd just been into retro things and it was better in the old days, we would have forgotten him. He would have made some theatre that was kind of vaguely inspired by the stuff he liked, and he would have been lost in the same way as people who look backwards in any media, I'm avoiding making comments about games here, are forgotten. Like the games that are very much tied to the past tend to be footnotes to the past that they're referencing. And it's something that would very easily have happened. I'm really sorry about all the note reading. It's because I'm falling off here. He would have been a retroactive step, but he wasn't, because he was a genius, and crucially, he had intent. He called it the distancing effect. Most people called it the alienation effect, but in my research and fact-checking, I realised that scholars hate that term now, and apparently you're an idiot if you call it the alienation effect. If you want to show off at parties, it's the Verfremdungseffekt. Basically this idea of the unreal, of the idea of distancing the audience from what they're seeing. This was Brecht's theatre. He would actively make plays and shows that reminded you were watching a play or show. He would break the rules. He would have like sports lighting, so everything was way overlit, so you could see exactly what was going on and see all of the horrible edges of the stage. He'd have music coming in appropriate times. He loved musical theatre because it was ridiculous. We share that obsession. He would have actors in rehearsal process actually kind of narrate their experiences. He'd do loads of things, and he kind of broke the fourth wall. That was his whole thing. And that was interesting. But crucially, it was done with intent. It was done directly to challenge the kind of theatre that was distracting people. It was just emotional and loving and romantic and ignorable. You know, Brecht wanted to argue and fight and make people think about the situation they were in and what was happening, you know, in the streets outside the theatre. That interest in that politics, the kind of the rise of communism and his reaction to it. And as I said, he definitely wasn't a communist. He told McCarthy, "It's fine." He was driven by that, and that became his focus. And that intent is what made that work powerful. It's the intent that made it not just a retrograde step, it made it something new. Now, of course, he got ripped off by everyone. You know, theatre, if you've looked at theatre in the last 50 years, we still cling to the classics, but we also, if you look at contemporary modern theatre, Brecht is all over it, he's all throughout it. But it's not limited to that. This was a point where I bring up a picture of Kevin Spacey in House of Cards. Now, in order to show at this point humility, I point out that that's a really bad example, because in House of Cards, it's direct address, which definitely existed before Brecht came along. Breaking the fourth wall became popular, but these were all techniques that already existed. We see that throughout television, theatre, and all over the place. I click now and there's an image of, because I've got to have Danny Wallace in every presentation, Danny Wallace in Assassin's Creed as Sean Hastings. I think that's his character name in Assassin's Creed. And I point out that we have this in games. You know, we have games that actively remind the player that they're playing a game. We have this in mainstream kind of AAA world with things like Assassin's Creed and its constant need to remind you that this isn't real, which is a really odd choice. Through to kind of Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, where you have this kind of this is just a story, this is just a story, this is just a story, and then lots of indie games which play with the same ideas and this same idea of breaking the fourth wall. And it's a fun thing to do and it looks cool. But my argument there is that the intent is gone. Assassin's Creed is an aggressively apolitical game. They literally put a disclaimer up at the start going, there is nothing political in this game, honest. I love Assassin's Creed, but they do that. They're not trying to be political. And when you look at most of the games that break the fourth wall and use those techniques that we associate with Brecht, they're not doing it either. they're not making Brechtian games, they're making games that break the fourth wall. And that's very different because the intent is gone. The politics of the act of making these is gone. So I thought some more about this, and I thought about, like, can I think of a game that does this? Click, Psycho Mantis comes up, and with, like, I think it's from the Twin Snakes, so it's referencing a Nintendo game. It's the bit where he reads your memory card. Very low resolution, this image, but I felt that would kind of add to the talk at this point. We've got a lot of HD source slides here, and this is the one that's really going to. I love that it keeps saying 7 out of 10 over my head while I talk. It's good. Like Metal Gear does this. Metal Gear breaks the fourth wall constantly and reminds you that it's a game. You've got Psycho Mantis, you've got reading the codec frequency off the back of the box, which blew my mind as a kid, because I was trying to solve that puzzle for a good 30 minutes before I realised, oh, it's the box in the real one. Although, well, and I had the awful PC port as well, so the box was not by the PC. The box was like in another room. There was exploration involved in me finding out that puzzle. Yeah, it's good. I like the Oars. They make me feel good. I like that. And then obviously in the sequel, you have literally them telling you to switch off your console, stuff like that. So that stuff's there. The kind of the stuff that Brecht made has been taken, but also the intent. You know, Metal Gear is a political game. It's a game about nuclear proliferation and war, and you know, obviously created by a team of young Japanese developers. So there's definitely a political connotation to them talking about those subjects. It's certainly something that mattered to them. Now, obviously, I have no idea if Kojima is into Brecht. I suspect he's not. I met him very briefly. I'm just going to name drop that. Didn't get a chance to ask him about his opinion of German theatre. I'm going to guess, though, that he's not into it. But that's kind of fine because I'm a critic and we don't have to kind of prove the underlying the underlying links. I can just assume that he did. He loves Brecht. But it doesn't really matter, I guess, is my point. The point is these were actions taken with intent. Those things, even if they were just done to be cool, they are achieving an outcome. You know, we talk about Metal Gear and its politics, arguably because of some of that stuff, because as kids we were playing that game and being reminded that this was weird and different, and therefore were more understanding of those things. I'm sure there was lots of other games in that period that were also about those things that we just kind of let slide over our heads because we were just enjoying the experience and we weren't having our attention called to it. That intent is important. It's important for a lot of reasons. Another key reason is when I've been talking about Brecht in the whole of this, I've not actually been talking about one fella. You know, crucially, most of Brecht's work was massively collaborative. He was definitely not a communist, but he had like a commune. Not communist. He knew some, and he'd be happy to tell you where they live. But he was not a communist. So all of this work was collaborative. Like even back then, the auteur theory was bullshit. Because the people around him were just as responsible for this work as he was. And that's the great thing about intent is transferable, and you can share intent with a team, and you can share the objective you're trying to achieve much easier and create incredibly powerful work that both stands the test of time and that you can slap your name on so that people will historically remember that as your work, which is great. I wouldn't do that. I have done that. His influence has changed everything in theatre. It's changed, definitely created the musical genre as we now know it. That's a stretch, but I'm going to let it slide because none of you are going to fact check this talk. And I think he's had an amazing effect as well on other forms of media. I think he has an amazing effect on games. I find him very inspiring. At this point, a self-deprecating slide comes up saying, "That's the end of the talk, please clap." Thank you so much. Cheers. Thanks for letting me talk for a while.